Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and we're going to continue our series. And in the introduction, I set it all up. John Calvin made some statements that have become a kind of myth within non-Catholic folklore, namely that the Council of Trent, when it came to the Old Testament canon, uh, adopted the so-called Apocrypha to provide new support for their doctrines. And he says that the Council of Trent gave these books authority that they never before possessed. And so that idea that these books never really were considered scripture, never had authority, and that Trent raised them up to new levels has been around and has been very common. The problem with this myth is that it's not true. And in fact, the best way to show it's not true is through Martin Luther himself, the one who rejected these books. So if you would like a condensed version of what we're doing in this series, check out our video, Luther's Flip-Flops. We did it a little while ago. You could probably do a search on our channel to find that. But if you want the in-depth discussion, definitely stay tuned, because that's what we're going to do here on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. So fasten your seatbelt, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. So was Calvin right when he said that the deuterocanonical books, which he calls Apocrypha, that they never enjoyed authority and that Trent raised them up to a status that they never enjoyed before? Yeah, a lot of people believe that, but the fact of the matter is it's wrong. And case in point, Martin Luther. Luther, of course, the founder of the Protestant Reformation, he is also the one who rejected these books as Apocrypha. And his decision stands and has transformed Protestantism so that it's pretty much universally agreed among non-Catholics that these books are Apocrypha and they're incapable of confirming doctrine. But is this so? Did he change his mind? Did he really flip-flop? Or is it true? These books just never had authority, and so Luther just never accepted them. And it wasn't until Catholics started to adduce doctrines from it that he decided to make clear these books can't be held on the same level as Scripture. Well, that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, the definitive point of his rejection took place on July 8th, 1519, in the disputation in which he, against Johann Eck, was debating Purgatory. So let's read what he says in this debate. He says, "There is no proof of purgatory in any portion of sacred scripture which can be entered into argument and serve as a proof. For the book of Maccabees, not being in the canon, is of weight with the faithful, but avails nothing with the obstinate." So Luther's denial in this debate basically is a threefold denial. First, he says that there is no sacred scripture that can be entered into argument. So that's the first point. Second Maccabees can't be entered into debate. Why can't it be entered into debate? Well, the second point, it can't be used to serve as a proof. In other words, it's incapable of establishing a point of doctrine. It lacks authority. And then the third point, Maccabees not being in the canon has weight with the faithful, but avails nothing with the obstinate. In other words, he denies canonicity. And in doing so, he aligns himself with St. Jerome on that issue. But like I said, how are we to understand this denial? Did Luther always follow Jerome on this point, that these books just simply are Apocrypha and they're edifying literature, but they can't confirm doctrine? Or did he flip-flop, like I suggested? Now, let me give you some background as to how these videos came about and what the series came about. Way back when I first wrote Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, this is the first edition, I was looking at how the Protestant reformers, how they understood the Deuterocanon, and I came across a very surprising article by H.H. Howarth. Now, H.H. Howarth is not Catholic. He's a Protestant historian, theologian, And he's very thorough, extremely thorough. So I found him to be a very trustworthy source. And in this article, he notes that Luther seems to have changed his mind on these books. So let's quote from the article from Haworth. It says, Luther answered in debate, this is his reply to Priorus, in the words of Augustine, that the only authority that he could accept on the matter was the canonical scriptures. What Luther actually meant at this time by the phrase "is libris qui canonici appellentior" is not quite clear, for we now find him in the resolutions commenting on theses published in 1518, quoting Sirach, while in his answer to Priorus, he quotes Tobias, in each case apparently as authoritative, unquote. So when I read that, I was thunderstruck because here Haworth dug up two instances where Luther seems to suggest in his argumentation prior to Leipzig, 1519, that he may have considered these books to be canonical scripture. But this was way back when I did my first edition of Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, and I couldn't confirm everything. I had much of it wasn't on the internet. The internet was still in its infancy, really. Much of my research was done by traveling down to seminary libraries, pulling books off the stacks, photocopying, taking notes. It was very difficult to do research. So in my first edition, I note that Haworth made this, but I didn't pursue it because I couldn't confirm everything. Okay. So about 20 years later, I amassed a whole bunch of other information that I didn't have back when I wrote Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger. And I approached Catholic Answers Press. They were interested in republishing my book. And I wanted to do a second edition where I can include all this information. Now, not only was I able to run down these two instances in Haworth, but I also found another instance as well that he does not mention. And so in my second edition of Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, so here's a shameless plug, which you can find at shop.catholic.com. I included this information and I show, Luther did a little bit of a flip-flop because ultimately my book, Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, the question it tries to answer is, did the Catholic Church add books or did Protestants remove books? So by Luther apparently doing this flip-flop, it definitively shows that the latter is true, that the Protestants removed books or downgraded books that were previously held as scripture. Okay. And, you can see the whole story there. And so that was fine. And that book was published. But you know what? As the years go on, the internet now is very robust. It's amazing what you could research and what you could find. And so I've dug up even more information. Now, right around this time, as I'm digging up information, I did the short version, the Luther flip-flop version, where I believe I show three sources where he apparently uses the Deuterocanon prior to 1519 in a way that's commensurate with sacred scripture, canonical scripture. Okay. But since then, I have found a lot more information, and I put it in an academic level article that I'm drawing on for these videos. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to do a deep dive into Luther. We're going to look at his career. And we're going to use those 3 points that he makes in 1519 when he rejects Second Maccabees as our guide for selecting what we're going to look at and what are we trying to see within these quotations. Okay. First, of course, Luther said that Second Maccabees cannot be adduced in debate. So we're not looking at Luther's homilies or letters. We're not looking at any other type of material. We're strictly looking at theological debates, either the debates themselves, the theses of the debates, or his defense or resolutions of debates and theses. Okay. And what we find is Luther actually adduces these books in several disputations up to 1519. The second thing, as we go through these disputations and theological debates, we're going to keep in mind and look for indications as to how he assessed these books. Did he believe they had enough probative weight to confirm theological points or doctrine? Okay. And try to assess where Luther is on the spectrum of the canon, right? Is he Augustinian? Is he a Jeromist? Or does he follow Jerome? Okay. And then third, we're going to look for indications about the canon, whether or not he says something about the canon, whether it's part of the canon, and so on. Now, I just laid down three things that I think I need to discuss a little bit and define. There are three positions that seem to have been out there. Okay, the first one is the Augustinian Canon. The Augustinian Canon affirms 7 deuterocanonical books that were affirmed at the Council of Trent. So these are the books of Wisdom, Sirach, Tobit, Judith, Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Also, some sections in Esther and Daniel as well. So Augustine distinguishes this canon as being the one adopted by the church as opposed to the one used by the rabbis of his time. Now, this same canon was affirmed in the North African councils of Hippo Regius in 393, Carthage 3 in 397, Carthage 17 and 419, and also a series of papal documents such as the Decree of Damascus in 382, the letter of Pope Innocent to the bishops of Gaul in 405, and ultimately the Ecumenical Council of Florence in 1442, and the Council of Trent, 1546. So that's the Augustinian canon. Okay, he proposes it in his work on Christian Doctrine, 283. And like I said, this has found its way into the law of the church and through councils and papal statements. Now, as opposed to Augustine, there is also Jerome's position on the canon. Now, Jerome believed that the Hebrew text was the true and authentic text of the Old Testament, so that whatever it did not include was to be considered spurious or apocryphal. And you can find this in his preface to Samuel and Kings. He assigned the 7 books that we just mentioned to the so-called Apocrypha, stating that they should be read for the edification of the people, but not be used to confirm doctrine. You can find this in the prologue to the Book of Solomon, or Books of Solomon, excuse me. Although evidence suggests that Jerome actually, near the end of his life, reversed his opinion on these books, nevertheless, these prefaces become paradigmatic of his view on the canon, at least as it was transmitted through his prefaces to the Latin Vulgate and was made known to the church in the West. So that's Jerome's position, that these books are, in a sense, spurious. They're nevertheless could be edifying for people, but you can't use them to confirm doctrine. And most importantly, for Jerome, they are not canonical. Okay. Now, this is different from a position that developed in the Middle Ages, which I'm going to call the Jeromist position. Okay. And the Jeromists wanted to have a middle position between Augustine's canon and that of Jerome. Okay. And the Jeromists held that the Deuterocanon is canonical in that it's accepted by the church, which of course can't be denied, especially at that point. But they denied that these books had full canonical weight so as to confirm doctrine. And you could even have more on this extreme end of the Jeromist. You actually have some people who say that church councils and decrees should be understood in light of Jerome's dictum in his prefaces. And for example, Thomas de Vio, or Cardinal Cajetan, as he's better well known, is a good example of the extreme Jeromist position. You can see that in his commentary on Esther. So again, let me outline this for you. You have Augustine. These 7 books are canonical and can confirm doctrine. On the other end, you have Jerome, who says they're not canonical, they're edifying, but they can't confirm doctrine. Then you have the Jeromist in the middle, who says they're canonical, But within the canonical scriptures, there are actually books that can't confirm doctrine. They should be used for edification, which is neither Augustine's approach nor Jerome's approach, because Jerome denied that they're canonical. And so it's a really peculiar position that really doesn't have roots in the early church. So anyway, when we're looking at Martin Luther's disputations and theological disputes, let's keep that in mind. Which one of those three positions does he hold on to? Does he believe in Augustine, that these can confirm doctrine and they're canon? Jerome, that they can't be confirmed canon because they're not canonical, so they can't confirm doctrine? Or the Jeromists, that they're canonical, but they can't confirm doctrine? Okay, so with that in mind, let's begin our survey. And I think we'll probably do two of them for this video because I don't want to make it super long. I'd rather do nice little bite-sized pieces. The first disputation that I was able to find in Luther's works, and again, I'm using Lutheran sources, Protestant sources, and whenever I can, I'm going to use a Protestant translation of a work. If I couldn't find any, I'll give you my own translation from the Latin, so you can have a grain of salt with that, but I just want you to know that. Okay, the first one on the docket is the question of the strength and will of man without grace, which was published in September 1516. Now, this is a very early disputation. It's before he nails his 95 thesis, obviously. But I think that's a great place to start, very early on in Martin Luther's career. Now, this first disputation where Luther adduces a deuterocanonical book is actually something that's really not a very well-known debate. It debates the will of man without grace, which actually does fit into and is important in Luther's theology as it grows and changes. This disputation, however, is only indirectly reflects Luther's view at the time. As William McSorley points out, quote, "These theses were drawn up by Luther's pupil Bernard of Feldkirch, Swabia, but with the help and approval of Luther, who was able to refer to the teachings contained in the theses as, quote, my position," unquote. Although Luther is not the author of this, the dispute is nevertheless included in standard collections of Luther's works. And so that's why I included here. And since the deuterocanonical text is adduced in this dispute, it's included in this survey. So the quote I'm going to give is from his third conclusion of the second corollary, Corollary 2, where the deuterocanonical book of wisdom is adduced along with a number of proto-canonical quotations. Now, I was unable to find any English translation of this dispute. Like I said, it's not very well known, but I'll give you a summary of what's there in the Latin. And as you can see, he says, since to the believer all things are possible through Christ as the author, it is a superstitious human decision whether other saints are worthy of hatred. Mark said that all things are possible to the believer. And then he quotes Mark 9, Matthew 21, Romans 8. He also quotes Augustine concerning grace. He quotes Matthew 19, and then he quotes the book of wisdom, the deuterocanonical book, Wisdom 8, and followed by a quote from 2 Timothy 4, Ephesians 2, and again Augustine, then finally Ezekiel chapter 11. So here Luther and his pupil adduces a deuterocanonical book, the Book of Wisdom, as part of his argumentation. And as you can see from this quotation, it's part of a larger cluster of quotations from the proto-canonical text of the Old and New Testament. Now notice, wisdom is quoted without any qualification or distinction in regards to its authority. And this suggests that since it's just simply cited in this cluster amongst the proto-canonical books, the impression is given that all the books share the same approbative weight or canonical authority. After all, if you're in church and your pastor is quoting sections from Scripture and then he wants to throw in something that's not Scripture, you better believe he's going to qualify. He's going to let his congregation know this text I'm about to quote is not part of the Bible, but nevertheless, it's edifying, right? He doesn't do that. Now, this has not that great weight for our survey. First, he was only indirectly involved with this, but he did look it over and apparently had no problem citing wisdom in debate and apparently to serve as a proof. So just give it, I would give it a weak affirmative that he seems to accept the Deuterocanon as canonical. Okay, let's move to the next one because this one's very different. It's actually a very important debate within the history of the Reformation. That is the Heidleberg Disputation of April 1518. In April of 1518, Luther engages in one of the most famous public debates, Heidelberg Disputation. It's a debate that Luther presents his theology of the cross. The dispute centered around 29 theological theses and 12 philosophical theses. Although Luther did not personally participate in the disputation, he is nevertheless the author of these theses. So this is more important and more direct evidence than what we saw in the previous disputation. This is actually comes from the pen of Luther. In the 9 theological theses, Luther once again adduces the deuterocanonical books, only this time it is from the book of Sirach. The text says, quote, "For in such a way God is constantly deprived of glory which is due to him and which is transferred to other things, since one should strive with all diligence to give him the glory, the sooner the better. For this reason, the Bible advises us, do not delay being converted to the Lord." Sirach 5:8. Now, this is a formal citation. Unlike the previous disputation, Luther formally quotes Sirach as the scripture advises us. Now, to the careful reader, you might say, hold on, Machuda. He doesn't say the scripture advises us. He says the Bible advises us. And in fact, in this English translation, again, I'm citing from standard Lutheran work, Luther's Works, 100-volume set, edited by Pelican. The footnote 7, so this is volume 31, page 47, footnote 7 says, quote, "This quotation is from Sirach 5:8. The Latin Vulgate contained the apocryphal books." This, to me, sounds as if the translator is telling the audience that Luther actually isn't quoting Sirach as scripture. He's just quoting from a book that was found in his Latin Vulgate, namely from the Apocrypha. Now, why do I think that's the insinuation? Well, because of the translation. Although the translation says, "For this reason, the Bible advises us," what it actually says in Latin, and this is the text that the English translation is based on, he uses the word scriptura. For this reason, the scripture advises us. The translator, apparently feeling the sting of this formal quotation from a deuterocanonical book in debate, wants to soften it and give the appearance that Luther's just quoting willy-nilly from the books he found in his Vulgate, which included books that were spurious or apocryphal. But that's not what the Latin says. He actually says, "For this reason, the scriptura advises us." So here we have another disputation, 1518 Heidelberg Disputation, a thesis written by Martin Luther, where it shows that Luther believed that Sirach was capable of confirming doctrine. That is, it had full and sufficient canonical weight to serve as a proof in debate. The exact thing he denies a couple years later in 1519, well, actually 1 year later in 1519, with Second Maccabees. And so you could see that trajectory where he's using the deuterocanonical books and apparently holds to the Augustine Canon, that these are canonical works capable of confirming debate. So we're going to stop right here. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, tell your friends. Let's grow the channel. William Albrecht and myself are on Patreon. We appreciate your support. It's very costly finding material to make these videos, so we appreciate it if you can help out. And until next time, I'm Gary Machuda. Thank you so much for watching.